Almost every single person that I've talked to for this channel so far has asked me one question. Have you talked to Sarah Marino yet? Well, with this episode, I can officially say, yes, I have talked to Sarah Marino. And she is as thoughtful and generous as ever with her insights. And you're going to get a lot out of this conversation. Welcome to Pixels, where we explore the heart and art of photography. I'm Beth Bilo, and I'm really glad you're here. Sarah and I only got to about half the questions that I wanted to ask her, but we covered a lot of ground. We talk about nature first principles, experiencing reciprocity with our subjects, why we should keep our absolutely worst photos, and the evolution of her photography over the past 13 years. We talk about all of that and a lot more. Sarah Marino is a nature photographer, photography educator, and writer based in southwestern Colorado. In addition to photographing grand landscapes, Sarah is best known for her photographs of smaller subjects, including intimate landscapes, abstract renditions of natural subjects, and creative portraits of plants and trees. Sarah is the author or co-author of a diverse range of educational resources for nature photographers on subjects including composition, photographing nature's small scenes, and black and white photography. Sarah, a co-founder of the Nature First Alliance for Responsible Nature Photography, also seeks to promote the responsible stewardship of natural and wild places through her photography and teaching. She and her husband, Ron, are co-authors of the eBook Beyond the Grand Landscape, which can be purchased through their website at smallscenes.com. A very special thank you to Nature Photography Classes and their Inspired Creator Grant, which in part makes this channel possible. You can learn more and submit your own application at naturephotographyclasses.com/inspired-creator, and the link is down below in the description. Please let us know in the comments what you found most meaningful or useful in this conversation. We would love to hear from you, and I really appreciate any support of this channel through your subscriptions, your likes, your shares, and of course, your comments. Now, on to the conversation. Hi, Sarah. I have been very much looking forward to talking with you. So thank you for making time to join me for the podcast.
Yeah, Beth, I've so enjoyed what you're doing with this. And I've been really looking forward to talking with you, especially after listening to some of your other conversations. And I just love that you're going deeper and asking some harder questions. And I think talking about things that are sometimes hard to put into words and hearing other people go through some of those ideas. I think it's been really interesting and thought provoking. So the fact that you invited me on today, I'm super excited for this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome. And you're going to add so much to the conversation. So I'm excited to see where we go. I'd like to start out just by asking what's making you smile today.
Well, we went camping over the weekend and we have had a crazy, crazy set of storms coming through Southwest Colorado. And it's just been so much rainier than normal. So it's been really nice that everything is so green. Like my garden looks fantastic, but over the weekend when we were camping at slightly higher elevation, the first hints of fall were popping up and seeing colored leaves and like some of the flowers just like having those beautiful little orange and yellow spots on them. It's like, okay, fall is right around the corner. There was snow on the top of the mountains the other day, which is really early, but still it was just like, I love fall so much. I think as most other nature photographers do. And so it was exciting to just see those first little hints. I'm not ready to say goodbye to summer yet, but I'm still really excited for fall being right around the corner.
Yeah, there's a bittersweetness to it. My husband and I drove up north this past weekend, and we were seeing I think almost every time we passed a tree that had some starting to change, we're like, look. So share your excitement and smiles around that. So I want to dive in and talk a little bit about your new ebook. And it's new-ish, right? Because it's a second edition.
Right. It's a fully revised second edition. I went way overboard with the revision, I would say. So it is actually, it's the second edition, but it feels pretty much brand new.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. And I've got my copy and I've just started to scratch the surface of it. And what I gather so far is it's called Beyond the Grand Landscape, a guide to photographing nature's small scenes. And it's like 291 pages. It's intense and set up. What I like is that it seems like you are kind of holding our hand through a process of exploring and discovering and trying some new things, because it has an accompanying workbook. Am I reading that right? That there's you're leading us through something.
Yes, and I think it's meant to be like what a workshop with me would be like if we were able to work together over many months. It's like thinking through your motivations, thinking through how naturalist skills can build your ability to connect with nature, to see more deeply, to think about what your motivations are and how you can reflect that in your work, your mindset. So some of your habits, like, are those habits helping you be a more effective photographer, or are they sometimes getting in the way of you being the best version of yourself? Looking at some of those more kind of internally facing questions, and then also building the skill set of if you have an idea, how can you successfully realize that idea from a more technical standpoint? So it's we cover, and I say we because my husband, Ron Coscarosa, is also a nature photographer. It's our ideas together. So when we think about photography, it's like we want to be good at both. And so this ebook is, I think, about thinking through some of the harder things and questions about creativity and facing towards you, and then also building the technical skills and putting those two things together to just build your skills at photographing small scenes, but then also having some skills that you could apply in a lot of other areas of photography as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a feeling after I've finished reading it and going through it, I'm going to want us to have another conversation. Because even just based on what you were saying, I thought, oh, we could talk about that and we could talk about that. So more to come, I hope.
Yeah, I welcome that.
Well, you touched on, you said something about motivations, and that's the question that I pulled out right away that I wanted to hear your thoughts on. And I just want to quote from the book for a moment. You and Ron wrote, having a photographic vision can be as simple as understanding your motivations, applying your unique view of the world to your photography practice, and creating photos that are reflective of who you are as an individual. And I have to admit, when I first read that, I thought, as simple as, and I thought those are really heady things, right? But you're the way you lead us through it, I think, is helping us to kind of tease it out and demystify getting to those motivations. So I'm curious about your personal motivations, and to maybe borrow the question I asked John Barclay, like, why a camera? Maybe. So kind of a two-parter there.
Yeah. So I listened to John's interview this morning. I had planned to listen to little bits and pieces of a couple that I hadn't listened to yet. And then I ended up listening to John's entire interview and immediately texting him and saying that was so great. So I'm going to probably reference that conversation a couple of times. So for all of your viewers, if you haven't watched John's, I would highly recommend it.
And I'll link it up there.
Yeah. So I think that my answer to that question first, the why the camera, is so similar to what John said. And I think it's because it really does help me see the world more deeply and connect in a totally different way than I had been able to before. Ron and I were actually talking about this over the weekend, how sometimes you'll see on social media or online kind of a minimizing thing, like, oh, a tourist has their phone is this intermediary and they're not actually experiencing what they're seeing. And I think that can sometimes be the case, that sometimes, like, if you're at a concert and people are just filming instead of actually watching, like, I can understand that for sure, that sometimes we are just living our lives for the photograph instead of actually living. But in my case, I feel like using my camera and pursuing nature photography for now 13 years, I think, it has deepened my relationship with the natural world and made me a much better observer than I ever was before. And I think all of those observations really help build those connections and respect and build excitement. Like, I think it's a self-reinforcing cycle of I see something that excites me and then I want to see, like, okay, I've seen lichen in this one environment. Now I want to see what type of lichen grows in every other place that I visit and compare and contrast, and then learn more about this really confusing and complicated life form and how it occurs, why it occurs, what it indicates about that particular ecosystem. And I don't think I would have ever gone down that path without a camera. I think that that's the basic answer. I've tried lots of other creative avenues, and the camera is the thing that has stuck.
May I ask what else you've dabbled in?
Oh, I've dabbled in everything. I have tried watercolor, and I really enjoyed watercolors. I have tried pottery. I have tried like metal things. I don't know exactly what you'd call it. Metalworking. I made jewelry and sold it online for years. I'm trying to think, knitting, crocheting. I've done embroidery. I have some embroidery upstairs that I never finished. So I wouldn't necessarily call those, some of them I think had an artistic aspect, but definitely creative and crafty, and just always been interested in that sort of thing. But photography is the thing that has resonated the most. And I don't understand. I can't explain, but it's definitely I think a healthy obsession for me. Yes.
Yeah. It's okay to be obsessed. It just depends on what it's about. Right.
And,
and as you were sharing about why a camera, why photography, I can hear why those other things wouldn't necessarily grab you by the heart, because there isn't necessarily that connection to nature. And it sounds like that's something that's very core to who you are as a photographer and as a person, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that like the watercolor, where you're interpreting a landscape and then communicating your interpretation through that artistic medium, I think that was probably the closest. But I just haven't invested the time to get better at it. Whereas with photography, I think that evolution just felt more natural. Yeah. So it's felt like I've had success. So, and that success has made me feel like I've been encouraged to continue, because it's felt really good. And the learning curve has been probably a little less than what painting is. So I think a lot of those dynamics have kept me excited for years. Yeah. This has probably been the thing I've been most excited about in my life consistently.
Yeah. Cool. And I know you and I both share a nonprofit background, so it's very different than what we experienced there. That had its own thrills, maybe, but very, very different.
I'd actually be interested to hear about your experience. And I know you're still doing coaching and some of that, whereas I've pretty much fully transitioned to nature photography. But I really miss the mission-oriented aspect of the feeling motivated. I was doing something more than myself. I was part of a team. That world, I think, is naturally collaborative. And I've tried in so many different ways to collaborate and to build relationships and be more mission-oriented. And it's much more of an uphill battle. A battle might not be the right word, but it just takes so much more effort. So I feel like I love photography, and I find it very challenging, very consistently challenging, but I really miss some aspects of my nonprofit work.
Totally get it. Yeah, I'll just share quickly. Yeah, I was doing some team coaching and working with some senior leadership, a team of 7. And I was just part of their staff meetings once a month for 2 hours. I loved those 2 hours because it felt good to be in community with others and to hear the way that they bounced off each other and their thought processes, and getting excited about some things and frustrated about others. Yeah, there is something about the life of, I would probably say most photographers are forging away on their own in some way. And if you're used to collaboration, being part of a team, being part of something bigger than yourself, it can be really, it can be challenging to, like you said, you got to push yourself a little bit. I mean, you mentioned reaching out and looking for that community and collaboration. What do you feel like does help to sustain you, especially when you're missing that bigger sense of mission?
Yeah, I don't have a great answer. I think it's probably been my biggest struggle with doing this as a job, is that maybe my personality fit in a little bit better with that more kind of collaborative environment. Whereas here, sometimes in this field, competition does bubble up more.
Yeah.
And I think I'm not naturally as suited to work in that environment. Like I try to be as generous with information as I can be and very like an open book. And I don't know that that's always served me as well in this field as it did in my previous career. So I have been really intentional about trying to build a network across very wide geographies. That's another challenge, is like you can have an instant connection with somebody and then you see them once or twice a year. So it's like friendship and professional trust and professional development and networking, like it takes place on these incredibly long time scales in this field. Whereas if you're working with people on a more day-to-day basis, some of that is more natural. I don't have a good answer because I'm still searching. I am trying to do more conservation related work because it's the more mission-oriented piece of things, but I still haven't figured that out either. So this is probably one of the areas I have the most to learn and most to grow in with regard to the definition of, or like the identity of professional photographer. The photography stuff I feel okay with. It's this other, I think the other like identity issues that are a little bit more complicated.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because it resonates with me. I'm guessing it's going to resonate with others, that you're not alone if you feel like you're a little challenged or feeling frustrated with any of that. So thank you for sharing a little bit of what you've been doing around it. This is sort of a part two to that motivations question, which is around if our photographs are a representation of us and who we are and to some degree our identities, what do your photographs say about you?
Yeah, I think that's a hard question to answer. Of all the questions you are proposing, we discuss, I think this one's one of the harder ones, because I think on the surface level, I think it's obvious that I like soft light, I like soft colors. I'm drawn to calming situations and scenes in nature. I really enjoy the feeling of walking around and just seeing what I'm connecting with and what catches my eye. And sometimes that's really mundane things. And then I want to create a photograph of those things. So I think that's the surface level answer. And then when I start interrogating, like, what is the actual reason? Like, why am I drawn to those sorts of things? And I think the answer that I keep on coming back to is that I do have an incredibly busy mind. So constantly thinking, overthinking, thinking about the past, thinking about the future, and not being very good about living in the present. And I think that's probably the one most valuable thing that photography has done for me, is helped me understand what it means to live in the present and experience the present moment, and then being able to apply that in other places. So like the experience of intensely focusing on a subject and just feeling like it's like that in the moment feeling. I think it's what some people call flow. I don't quite identify with the idea of flow in my own work, but I think maybe my experience gets close to what other people describe as feeling like things are flowing. Like then being able to then apply that to other parts of my life. Like I feel like I'm a less anxious person. I feel like I'm better about being present in the moment and thinking less about the past and more about the future. And I think it has been my photography practice, which is probably in some ways meditation for me, and teaching me how to be just more in tune with that present moment. And because of that, because of the busy mind, that I want to organize chaos, and that comes out in the compositions I choose. I like calming and relaxing and graceful type scenes. Elegance is a word that often comes to mind when I'm thinking about composition for myself. And I think it is in a reaction to, like, I'm seeking the opposite of what it's like to be inside my head sometimes. So like on the more superficial level and like that right below the surface, I think that's as far as I've gotten to think about what my photography shows about me. But I guess that's where I've gotten. And it feels like to have that knowledge, I think it has helped me think through like how I can improve my life in other ways. And that's an insight that photography brought to me.
Yeah, beautiful. So what came up as you were sharing, and I don't think I'd thought about this before, but there's an aspirational aspect. Like the photographs are reflecting an aspiration that you have personally in terms of your energy, wanting to quiet the mind, be a little more meditative, the elegance and whatnot. I'm curious if that resonates, or, what you think of that sort of framing.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to frame it. Like one of the things I talk about a lot when I'm working with photographers, more on the mentoring side of things, is like that photography in a lot of ways is aspirational, and it helps you think about, like, do you want to be more adventurous? Do you want to be more self-confident? Do you want to feel like you have more reliance when you're outdoors? That photography can bring out some of those aspirations and then give you a reason to pursue them. And I think in my case, one of those aspirations was to be like a calmer, less intense, less type A type person. And I think photography in some way has gotten me there. So that aspiration is something that I think that idea does resonate a lot.
Yeah.
That's a great observation.
Well, I take that back to, now I'm recalling part of my conversation with John Barclay and talking about photography as almost art therapy. I think that's something that we talked about. And
yes.
And there's an opportunity to look at our photographs and see what from the unconscious or what from the subconscious is coming through. Why am I taking these photos? Like I'm almost thinking of mine, and I'm like, mine are abstract and sometimes a little chaotic. And I think, okay, so what is that reflecting that I need, maybe? And maybe it is some of that confidence or boldness or being more comfortable with disorder, not needing things to be nice and neat and tidy.
Yeah, I could identify with that one.
Yeah. So there's so much that we could be diving into and getting from our photography, besides, in addition to, I should say, the pleasure of the actual act of taking the photo, of working with it, and then of sharing it. There's an opportunity to see it as a mirror. And
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I think that this is an example of one thing that I do feel like is important to always reiterate, and I try to do this in every conversation like this, is there's no right way. Like sometimes there's a full continuum of reasons to photograph. And sometimes you don't need to have a really deep reason. You might just want to be outside and enjoy and have a distraction. And that's a perfectly valid reason to photograph. Other people might be working through some really deep mental health issues or other issues. And photography is a component of healing or of working through grief. And that full continuum is a fully valid way of expressing your creative spirit and intentions. And we might flex between those different places as we go through our artistic or creative journey. So I don't think there's a right answer. And I always feel like these kinds of conversations, I do want to reiterate that I don't think that you have to be going deeper if that's not what you're seeking. And sometimes I also don't think that photography, or like the emotions that you're feeling, have to play out in your photography. That sometimes it's the act of photographing that is really more helpful. A couple of years ago, in 2020, actually, my father passed away, and I was very close to him. Had a great relationship with him, and immediately after the funeral had to get to Death Valley to teach a workshop. And when I look at my work from that time, it was light and bright and airy, and definitely was not indicating that feeling of grief and like the dark place that I was. So it wasn't about the way the photos look. It was about the process of having time outside to clear my mind, process that experience, honor because my dad was into photography, and I never connected it at the time because our time with photography never overlapped, but like his influence on me, and I might not have started photography if I hadn't seen those popular photography magazines strewn around the house and seen him with camera gear and all those other things. So it's like that I was processing that, but it didn't show up at all in my work. And so sometimes like we can decouple what's showing up in our work with what we're processing behind the scenes. And sometimes we don't have to process anything at all. And we can just be having fun, and that we're relieving stress or distracting ourselves. And all of those are valid. So
yes,
that was
yeah,
a long
absolutely.
diversion.
Thank you. No, it's absolutely important because I can forget that not everybody, and not everybody and not everything needs a deep dive, that it can just be what it is. And there's pure pleasure just in that. So a question comes up that came up in a workshop I was in recently with TJ Thorne, where we talked about if you could go out into the field with your camera and take out the memory card. So no memory card, and you set your camera so it will, it'll release, or, you can press the shutter with no memory card in it. How would that influence your experience? And would you do it at all?
Well, given that I share very few of my photos, I think the answer is like I do it all every single time I go out to photograph. Yeah. That like this is very similar to the question, like if you couldn't share your work, would you still photograph?
Yes.
And I think the answer for me has always been absolutely. Like I do this for me, that the sharing is a bit of a side benefit. And this, you and John talked about some of this, like the having an audience and caring about what people think. And maybe it's getting older, maybe it's feeling more confident, maybe it's just like enjoying who I am as a person a little bit more. I really just don't have nearly as much concern about how my work is received, or like I photograph some really strange things, and a lot of them are what a lot of people would say are totally boring, and I love it. And so I feel like I'm doing that already. Like that exercise that you and TJ were talking about, I feel like that's how I photograph. Definitely has not always been like that. Not at all. Yeah. But I would say for the last maybe 3 to 4 years that I think that's kind of my style of photography, is photographing only for myself, and being glad that things resonate, but not having it be much of a motivator.
Not necessary for validation, because it sounds like you've got a lot of self-validation.
How did you answer that question?
Oh, what was my question? I always do that. Would I do it? Yes, I would do it. It would be, I don't know that I could do it as easily as the way you just described, because for me, part of my personality since I was little, was that if I created something, I had to share it. Like it was not about, I couldn't keep it to myself. If I wrote a poem, if I did a doodle or whatever, I had to share it. And so for me, the cycle of, the act of planning or anticipating taking a photo, going and spending time in that place and taking the photo, processing it, and then sharing it. It's like, I need that cycle. I would probably still do it. I just couldn't do that all the time. I think it would be an interesting thing to do once at least, to see what happens, because there, you talked about that word flow. That's, to me, that's like 90% of the joy of photography, is being in the field, being in relationship with the camera, being in relationship with the environment, and just being in that creative space.
Yeah, like I think that one of the things you said that really, well, 2 things you said resonate. First, that cycle, like that was something I taught a lot in the nonprofit world, is like you do something, you learn from it, you adapt, you consider that feedback, and like that cycle is really important. So yes, like not having the products of your time in the field to learn from, that's, I think, a really important point. And then also the time investment of not having like that result. That is something that I do really like, is even if I'm not sharing it with anybody, I still love, I joke that my best photography skill is aimlessly browsing my Lightroom catalog. And like that, because I love reliving moments that I've had. And so like the not taking out the memory card and still taking photos, like that would remove a really important part of the process for me, which is reconnecting with that moment of joy or excitement or feeling frustrated and challenged. And those seeing photos has all that bubble up. And that's part of the thing that I love most about photography.
Yeah, exactly. So pros and cons, right?
Yes.
Just like everything, pros and cons. And it's a very interesting, not just a thought exercise, but I think it would be an interesting practical exercise to notice what does it feel like to go out, maintain your photography mindset and vision and imagination, but release attachment to the outcome, i.e. the photos, because there aren't any, except in your imagination, in your mind. I think it'd be a worthy experiment.
Yeah. And I think for some people, like releasing the result could actually encourage them to try things that they otherwise wouldn't try.
Yes.
Because there would be no accountability or no feeling of failure, because there wouldn't be the remnants of that experience. So I think if for anybody listening who does feel stymied in their progress, like that type of experimentation maybe could be helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I want to, before I do actually want us to look at some of your images. But before we do that, I just have one question that also came from the book, which was about reciprocity. That word was used fairly early on, and it appears a few more times. And I'm curious about what role reciprocity plays for you, particularly as it pertains to being out in nature.
So the first time I became aware of this idea, which I'm kind of embarrassed to say, but it's the truth, because I don't have a science background. I never studied much natural history or any not nature related subjects in college or for my master's degree. So I'm pretty new to this world. And so Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer was the first book that I had read that really talked about this concept. And that book overall, like the way she talks about plants and the way she talks about her relationship with plants and the meaning in her life that they hold and the stories that they tell, was a really important learning experience for me, that we can have deep relationships with subjects in the natural world that before might have just seemed like, oh, you walk by hundreds of plants a day and never give them a second thought. Well, that book taught me, I think, just to think about the natural world in a totally different way. And she talks mostly about plants. So transformational read for sure. And one of the things she talks about is reciprocity. And she talks about it in a lot of different ways, but a couple that bubble to the top for me. First is learning. So having more knowledge about what you're photographing so that you understand. It would be, I think it's helpful to be able to name 2 or 3 interesting things about the subjects we're photographing. If you don't have a scientific background or experience in geology or botany or lots of different nature subjects, you still can learn those like little interesting facts that help build your connection with your subject. So I think that's one of the first things that bubbles up for me, is that first, reciprocity is just caring enough to learn. And then once you've learned a little bit, being willing to communicate that with others. So something that I've been trying to do more through my writing and in my in-person teaching is just educating people more about the things that I've learned about the natural world. So again, I don't have a science background. It's not as complete as it could be, but I feel like by sharing my love for my subjects and what I've learned about them, it can encourage some of the same cycle in other people. I think it's also about respecting the natural world. So learning about leave no trace. I was part of the group that came up with the nature first principles. So putting the well-being of your subjects ahead of your photography and actively practicing those things so that you're not trampling wildflowers for a photograph. You're like for wildlife photographers, you're not baiting wildlife or birds to get a better photograph. So that respect, I think, is also an important part of reciprocity. And then getting back to our nonprofit backgrounds, giving back, whether that's working with conservation organizations, it's donating, reading newsletters, supporting causes, communicating about conservation projects and protecting wild places. And in this election year, voting to protect those places and preserving wild places is a really important public policy issue. Educating yourself about some of those things and what's happening in the places that you care about, then potentially using your photographs to help advance some of those conservation related causes. So for me, starting with Braiding Sweetgrass and getting to where I am today, I'd say those are the things that continue to bubble up for me. And I'm not perfect at it at all, but I'm trying to get better about doing all four of those things.
Yeah, beautiful. I'm thinking about the proliferation of photographers, and I'm sorry, I'm putting it sort of in quotes, but people who are traveling to different spots just for the Instagram shot, and that sort of thing. And how can we as photographers not contribute to that culture? Like, we might say, like, we were here first. I stood on the edge of the Grand Canyon or whatever and did this, and you're just doing it because you just want something for Instagram. Well, how can we avoid being part of you've probably already named some of those ways, but any further thoughts on how we as photographers can avoid being part of that particular problem?
Oh my gosh, Beth, that is such a hard question. It's so hard. So we went to Iceland in June, and it was our 6th trip. And Ron and I in 2012, we wrote a book called Forever Light, The Landscape Photographer's Guide to Iceland. And it was a location guide for Iceland, no longer published. 3 or 4 years after we wrote that ebook, we went back to a location that we had included. And it was this area of little tarns surrounded by little plants. And we could see that the area was completely trampled, and it wasn't a place that you would stop unless you had a guide. And back then, like, our guide was the only guide to photographing Iceland. Things are obviously very, very different now. Yeah. So that was the first experience that I had where, what I put out into the world can actually have a really negative impact. And that made me start questioning my own practices. So we fully revised that guide, took out some locations, put in a lot more education about leave no trace, about respecting the landscape, bringing attention to some of the sensitivities that you might, if you weren't familiar with the place, you might not even think about. Yeah. So I think that was the first thing that I did, but then it still didn't feel like enough. So then I got together with some other photographers from Colorado, and we put together the 7 principles for nature first, which is, again, all about trying to put the well-being of nature before your photography. But it's still so those are things that I've personally done. Like, we have a guide to Death Valley, and every single location has information about the ecological sensitivities, how to reduce your impact, because I feel like I'd rather have somebody buy my ebook and learn about those things than not have that information. So, but again, I think it's all pretty naive. Like, I'm still encouraging people to go to places that like where they're, I don't know.
I know.
Like, coming back from Iceland this last trip, it felt like I was traveling in the United States. So then in some ways it feels like tourism has changed that country so much. Like, maybe I shouldn't go to those places anymore.
And doesn't that break your heart, on some level? Because there's so much tension between, like, wanting to go, wanting to witness it for others who can't go or won't go, but yet not wanting to contribute to that overrun trampling stuff.
Yeah, I don't think there's a good answer. Like, if you want to travel to certain places, you are in some way part of the problem. Yeah. And I think gets back to some of the reciprocity stuff that we were talking about, that if you are going to a place and you're sharing about it on Instagram or in a blog post later, that you're talking about some of these issues. Like, if you use the Grand Canyon as an example, make a donation to some of the groups in the area that are trying to do either education within the park, or they're working on, like, there are a bunch of uranium mines being proposed on the fringes of the park. Participate in raising awareness about some of those issues, or giving money to help conserve the areas on the fringes of protected landscapes. That it's in some ways maybe balancing out the scales a little bit. Yeah. But I still don't think there's a good answer. I think it's one of the biggest challenges for photographers right now, nature and landscape in particular. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks for those, highlighting the tension and helping us think about how we can lessen our impact and balance out, through that reciprocity. Because it's a challenge.
How do you think about these things within your photography?
I didn't know you were going to turn the tables on me.
We don't have to.
I'm just curious, it's good.
It's good. It's so hard.
It is hard. It is hard. And I'm not as well traveled as you are. Yeah. Mine has been much more limited. When I have learned though to be, conscious of being too specific with a location if it's in a fragile area. Death Valley, the places I've been are places people go no matter what. So I think it's okay if I say, this is Dante's View or, something else, because they're well known. But if I were to go into other parts of the park that were more fragile, and I know you've hiked all the trails, right?
All the established trails, and then we've been to almost 80 of the off the beaten path canyons.
Wow.
So
wow.
Lots of miles.
So if I was you when I grew up, I would hope that I would not, be saying, oh, this is 5 miles north of whatever landmark, So that's a small thing. It was recently in Olympic National Park, and we were encouraged, don't share what campsite we're at. There's no need, because there are areas like this all over the park. So if somebody wants this kind of scene, they can find it in lots of places. But how can we preserve this particular spot so that it doesn't become, because my single posting of a picture is going to drive thousands to that spot, right? But everybody who thinks that, if I were to think, a few hundred people might see this and nobody's going to go. If everybody does that, then it adds up, right? And the ripple effect that you mentioned before about educating ourselves, I'm one of the results of your ripple effect, because I'm trying to get better at it. Like even last night, I went out into my front yard and we have some plants that were already here that I didn't know what they were. So I used my app and looked it up. And is it native? Is it cultivated? Is it exotic? Is the plant healthy? What's it called? What's it symbolize? Is it used for anything? And so being able to name that plant in my post feels like it's a small way of honoring and having that reciprocity and being more respectful of, because I don't want to just take from the plant, right? Mm-hmm. I want to give it something. And it seems like what you're talking about is that honoring of it and respecting of it and saying, you gave me something, so I'm going to give you something, and by way of sharing something about you, introducing you to my friends.
Yeah. I think all of those ways that you explained, those are all great example,s
Always a work in progress. And,
yes, exactly. I feel the same way.
Well, let's turn to some images. Let's take a look at some photos. Yeah. So we're going to talk about some pivot pixels, some images that represent some sort of turning point in your journey. And so we're starting out here. And for those that are listening to the audio only, you can go to pixelspodcast.com and be linked to this episode where you can see the images that we're referencing. So please do take a moment to do that. But for everybody watching on YouTube, tell us what we're looking at, Sarah.
Yeah. So I think before I talk about the 4 photos that I shared for the Pixels pivot discussion, I'll go through a very brief overview of the 3 stages that I see of my landscape photography. So the first, which is represented by this photo, is where I was seeing things in the environment and then feeling a connection, feeling some excitement, curiosity, questioning. And then that resulted in me taking a photo. So in this case, it's not refined. The composition is not very good. The edges are a huge mess. There's a shadow poking in on the top. The light is really harsh. So this photo, though, represents that first stage of where it was really connection driven and just whatever bubbled up and felt exciting, I photographed. And so it was really a representation of just joy and connecting in the natural world. And then I started participating in a lot of online forums. And that experience, I think, turned my photography from just a creative outlet where I wasn't very good, but I was really having fun, to seeking external validation, absolutely driven by wanting attention, wanting to be taking a certain type of photo. So dramatic, opinionated foreground with big fancy mountains or some other dramatic thing in the background and really colorful light, really strong lines and shapes and like aggressive, dominant, kind of opinionated compositions. And that I think was because I felt like, I want to be following this trend. I want to be part of this, what this emerging body or this emerging style of landscape photography. And it was about getting attention online, getting feedback, and feeling like, oh, my work is being noticed. And also realizing at the same time, like, this is not what I enjoy. Like, I don't like sitting, or I don't like standing still. I don't like waiting for the perfect light. I don't like sitting on one composition for an entire sunrise or sunset. And I don't really like that near far composition that was really popular during that period of time. Cole Thompson and his photographic celibacy idea was really transformational for me. And the idea was essentially like, for a period of time, I stopped looking at photography because I wanted to figure out who I was. I was pursuing it for the wrong reasons. I wasn't feeling excited about it. It was stressing me out. I was judging myself really harshly. And so the act of disengaging from social media and really going out into the natural world and seeing like what bubbles up, what resonates the most, what makes me feel excited, where do I feel challenged, where do I feel like I'm engaging with my subjects. I want to photograph those things. And so I was getting back to the phase one. So this photo here is kind of an example of where I was at the first part of that process of really liking like the pattern and the little intricate details. And it's totally mundane. It's peeling mud in a wash in Badlands National Park. But there was something about this that drew the idea of it that drew me in. I just didn't know what to do with it. And the other example that I shared too, that we'll look at in a few minutes, was exactly the same situation. Here, so the more refined version, so the next photo, this is an example of where it's the same idea, so very similar subject, but it's under twilight light on a clear day, so really soft pastel colors. And since this is a reflective surface, those colors are real. It's twilight reflected onto a reflective surface, so it's not, those pinks and blues are actually what I was seeing with my eyes. Yeah. And then I was much more careful about the composition, that it's all about repetition and lines, like where things enter and exit, that the taking mud and making it feel graceful and elegant so it's essentially taking those original ideas, forgetting about that middle phase that I went through, and then now knowing what I'm doing and having more of a vision of what attracts me and what I want to communicate through my work, and then working with subjects like these. I think that's an evolution that I've gone through.
How much time approximately was between that first, I look at it, I think of leathery mud shot and this more elegant, refined mud shot?
So probably the actual distance in time was probably like 10 years about. I would say that first phase that I mentioned was probably like a year to a year and a half of where I was just out there kind of doing my own thing. And then probably like 3 to 4 years maybe in that middle phase. And then it was the year we got our Airstream trailer, which was 10 years ago, where I did that intentional photo celibacy period. So it's because the first time I did it was our first trip with our Airstream, where we were slowing down. So I had more time to spend on my work than I had before. We weren't moving with the weather. And so that's why it's notable in my mind, because we just are celebrating our trailer's 10th anniversary with us.
Woo-hoo. So congratulations. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks. Yeah, I wanted to know, because I think sometimes we get impatient with ourselves and how we see and the evolution of it. And that's one of the reasons why I incorporated this particular segment into the show, because I want us to all appreciate that it is an evolution and it takes time and work.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's why I'm still doing photography all these years later, is because I think it's hard. Like there's still so much I want to do that I've made progress, but it's still incredibly challenging.
Yeah. You're making me think of a Pablo Casal quote where a reporter asks him, Mr. Casal, you're 96 years old and you're considered the greatest cellist in the world. Why do you still practice 6 hours a day? And he says, because I think I'm making progress. And that's what I hear you saying is it doesn't matter how long you've been doing it. You keep evolving.
Oh, absolutely. Like that resonates a lot for sure. Like there's no destination in this field.
No.
For sure.
Well, let's take a look at this next one. And I smile when I see this one because a dandelion was one of my gateways to photography. So I'm curious to hear about this particular dandelion and its role in your journey.
So this is a giant dandelion called a salsify. And it's actually an edible plant. So people can forage this particular plant. Not something I knew at the time when I photographed this. So this is another example of very early on in my photography. It's like I saw something that I thought was interesting and photographed it, but I just didn't know what to do with it. And so the evolution photo is that being able to consider it as an abstract subject. So getting really close, using shallow depth of field and having a lot of the plant, that seed head, a lot of it is in front, out of focus. And then I'm focused well into the subject. So it takes what you saw before and turns it into something that's all about shapes and lines and soft colors. So it's the same idea as that I was drawn to this giant seed head. I didn't know what to do with it. But then once I built my skills and had a little bit more of a vision for my body of work, it's like, oh, now I know what to do with this. And I have the techniques, the technical skills to actually achieve the vision. And then I'm processing it and presenting it in this way, which is soft, light, bright. And then it fits in with a full body of work that I would consider kind of these daydreaming plants, where it's all focused on the softer side, the details that very few people pay attention to. But if you get really close and you investigate the details, that you can elevate them to a level of beauty and importance, and then present them in a body of work that I think says something about how I see the world. So, but I think both of these examples, the reason I included them in the pivot is that they represent the before times when I didn't know what I was doing, but I was still connecting with things, to now, which is where I do feel like I have a much more refined vision for how I see the world and what I want to present through my photography. Yeah. So a good pivot, a multi-year pivot, but a pivot nonetheless.
Yeah. Well, and you're an educator as well as, producing fine art photography that is seen in various commercial and residential and artistic venues. And you're producing this, this gorgeous photo here, but yet you still have that dandelion, that first one. I'm guessing part of that's because you're an educator and it illustrates something for anyone listening who's maybe not, what would you say about kind of holding on to images over time and what we might learn? I'm a little biased, I suppose, to holding on to them, but, is there something to be learned from kind of keeping them? Because I could see, myself saying, oh, well, look, I've got this gorgeous dandelion shot. I don't need that other one before, anymore. Delete any feedback or insights about how you decide what to keep and what to toss.
Well, I think it's incredibly valuable to keep the old stuff, because I just came across my first sunset photography session and oh my, like I was using the on-camera flash. So it was wildflowers on the edge of a lake and then a lake and then mountains. So mountains reflecting in the lake, and the horizon is so unlevel. The flowers in the foreground are completely out of focus. They're illuminated by flash. And then everything else is so dark. So it's like,
I can almost see it in my mind.
Seeing that and then seeing your progress. Like if you delete all that stuff, then you're missing a really important stage of your development as a photographer and as a creative person. So my advice is absolutely keep the old stuff, because it's really good to return back to it. And then once you start getting better, don't get rid of the iffy stuff, because you might have so first of all, it might be the seeds of a new direction that's starting to emerge, and you might not know what to do with it yet.
Yep.
But you might eventually have the technical skills to process it more effectively, or it might be an idea that seeing it is like, okay, I want to revisit that. So I'm going to try to take that idea and do it better. And if you didn't have that as a record, it might not prompt that thinking in your mind. So I do feel like that is also helpful. But that the emerging theme, and I can't remember who I was talking to about this. It could have been Eric Bennett, maybe. I can't remember, but it was very much like that you might not know that this is the direction you're heading in until you see more of a full body of work developing. And you don't want to get rid of that before you give it a chance to come to fruition. So even if you don't want it in your Lightroom catalog, you don't want it to be in your face, I personally tend towards keeping all of that stuff. Like, I think I have something like 260,000 files in my Lightroom catalog.
Ooh,
so,
wow.
So I photographed a lot, and I find value. It's also very well organized, so I can find what I need immediately, which is also makes having that many files okay. Fast computer, great organization, it's okay. But I think there's huge value to holding on to those things.
Yeah. Well, and I remember the first time I ever saw you present was at out of Chicago Botanic back in 2021. And you shared a photo that I remember you said, now when I took this photo, I was really proud of it. I thought it was really awesome. And now I look at it and I see it differently. You know, you can appreciate, and what I appreciate about what you were sharing about these first pixel, you know, the first iteration was you were saying there was something I was drawn to in it, and I didn't maybe execute it the way I would now, but there was a seed. And we won't know that. We won't see that progress if we just trash it all.
Yeah, it's really important data. So if you're throwing away that data, you might never be able to see the trends. So one example is if you keep on deleting the plant photos because they aren't that great, you don't actually see that you're really drawn to plants when you're outside. You just might need to spend a little bit more time working with them and refining your skills. But this is actually an area of interest that you have. So I feel like the things that make it into your files, like it's information, it's really helpful information as you're thinking about your creative direction, and also just checking in on your progress. Like that's, I think, a huge thing in terms of building confidence, so that you actually are making progress, and it's exciting and it should be celebrated. Yeah.
I get excited when I look back at something that I used to think was good, and I look at it and I say, I would do that differently now.
Yeah.
That actually makes me really happy.
Yeah, exactly. Like that. I think there's so much value in those moments and observations.
Yeah.
So don't throw stuff away.
Don't throw stuff away. Buy lots of SSD things, you know, and just save it all.
Memory's cheap right now.
Memory is cheap. So what are we looking at here?
So the reason that I included this one was, so I was in Wichita, Kansas at a botanic garden. And a lot of nature photographers would say Kansas, first of all. Botanic garden at the beginning of spring, like when nothing's blooming, like what is there to photograph? And my view is that I'm a happier person when I see beauty in the mundane and the everyday. So this is some yarrow leaves that were some of the first things that were growing in Wichita in April. And I love this kind of thing. I think it's a super plain subject, totally everyday, but this photo I think fits really well into my body of work. And so the reason I wanted to include this is that I feel like the more photographers can see beauty in any conditions, any light, any location, I feel like our lives are enriched. And the more you can see beauty in yarrow in Kansas in April, the happier you're going to be. So that's why I included this one.
Yeah. Because wherever you go, there you are. And
Yeah.
you can make the most of the situation. So now tell us about this.
Yeah. So when you asked me for kind of like something that didn't work out so well, or that I look back on and think, this is an example of where I feel like, again, that I was connected to the subject. This was one of the first times where I understood what it meant to organize shapes in a composition. Mm-hmm. And think about relationships. So for me, that felt like a creative breakthrough, because I was hearing people teaching about composition and saying, like, thinking about how two subjects are relating to each other and what story that might tell, and thinking, like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Like, this makes no sense to me. And this photo was the first time where I thought, oh, these are they're like twins, and they're in relation to each other, and their orientation to one another suggests togetherness and connectedness, and that communicates something about their relationship and the story of the photo. But the reason that I shared this here is that another reason not to delete your files. So this example, like, the contrast is way overdone, and the colors are so unnatural. For this one, I just recently reprocessed it, and I also have a black and white version. So I feel like this is a good example of how your skills and the way you see the world, how they evolve, you can revisit. So here's the revised version. It's lower contrast, it's brighter, and the colors are far more natural. Yeah. So if you saw this plant in similar light in the natural world, it would look much more like this than that very green, like kind of neon green version. And then the black and white version is a totally different interpretation. I've taken a lot more creative liberties with the processing. So decreasing the contrast and darkening the edges, so those two central plants come forward. And so my color work is very much grounded in the reality of my experience, and I think what people would expect when they see a subject for themselves. This is much more interpretation, where I'm applying a lot more of, like, I want those two subjects to stand out. I want it to be dramatic and higher contrast. And I'm going to then apply more in the processing phase to accomplish that vision for the scene. So this is an evolution in 3 steps. And I think, like, showing how building your skills over time, like, you can return to something and reinterpret it in a couple of different ways. And that I think that's one of the other fun parts about having your old files, is you might not know what to do with them, but in a couple of years, you might get to the point where, oh, this photo actually fits really well within a portfolio that I'm developing, and now I know what to do with these files.
Absolutely. And the technology also improves. To where, there might be different functionality that you didn't have before. I'm thinking specifically of, like, AI denoise that's now built into Lightroom. One can overuse that kind of thing, but you might have previously had a photo that you loved, but it was, like, super noisy, and maybe there's something that can be done about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I find myself really drawn to this black and white version, and partly because of what was also obvious in this evolved version, for lack of a better way of putting it, the softer, more natural, is that you can really see the lines in the leaves. You see them here, but I think with the more dramatic color, you see the color before you see the texture.
Yeah, for sure. It's much more homogeneous.
Yeah. And then with the black and white, the texture just is the light, and the texture is the star. So, that's gorgeous.
And looking at that middle one, I see I need to fix something on one of those edges. But that bright spot on the right edge needs to darken that.
Well, in real time, evidence that we're always, we're never quite done.
Exactly.
And distance helps us to see things with some fresh eyes, right? Is this next one a pivot pixel, or is it just related to something you had to share?
I think that one was, you had asked for the good, bad, and the ugly.
Yes.
And so that one, I shared this one as the good, because I think it's an example of how, like, letting your personal vision and the connections you make with the natural world dictate how you spend your time photographically. And this is an example of my trip to Iceland. Is I spent so much time photographing there were so many beautiful wetlands where you have these such beautiful transitions between colors and between plants. And I absolutely loved during that trip photographing these transition zones, because on every little pond we came across, there would be a different type of transition with different plants. And sometimes the transition was much harder. Sometimes it was much softer. Sometimes it was really dramatic in terms of colors and textures. And that's an example of letting that connection come to the forefront and say, I'm in Iceland and I'm going to photograph the edges of ponds.
Yes.
And I'm going to love it. So that's the reason I included this one, because who goes to Iceland and does that? I do. And I had such a great time. If we're talking about like listening to your instincts and like the motivations, like what motivates you, it's tuning into that and then feeling confidence in the fact that the subjects that hold some resonance for you are just as worthy as the more dramatic, epic, impressive landscapes. That if this is what resonates, this is what I want to spend my time on. So that's what I did.
Yeah.
So that's why I included this one.
Yeah. Epic is relative, and if we say epic just means like it was amazing. Yeah. It's beautiful. And I want to take a second with this, because when I think of Sarah, I think of small scenes. And one of the things you talk about in the ebook is about what defines a small scene. And I'm curious if you could just touch on that briefly, and if you would consider this particular image a small scene.
Yeah. So for small scenes, I consider everything from a telephoto intimate landscape of a big scene, but pulling out the slice that resonates most with you, all the way down to kind of like a macro subject of something that's not microscopic, so that you would be using like a traditional macro lens to photograph. So everything along that range is what I would consider a small scene. And what I said a moment ago about that small slice of the landscape that resonates with me, that's what came to the forefront in this particular situation. So the scenario for this was, we were near one of the more popular waterfalls along the South Coast. So we rented a 4x4 camper van, had planned to do only interior highland stuff, had really late snow, none of the roads opened. So we totally pivoted our trip and just did something totally different than we had planned. So that's the first example of like releasing all those expectations and plans and saying, we're going to make this work. The weather's awful. It won't stop raining. The wind is horrible. We're still going to photograph. So let's just make it work. So we were near one of the popular waterfalls. We were flying our drone, exploring some river channels. Ron was photographing birds. So it's like it's seeing opportunities when things don't work out and trying to make the best of a situation. And then sometimes that process of making the best of a situation, like it's actually a really good result, because I ended up being really excited about this series of photos that I worked on, because my previous visits to Iceland, I had focused almost entirely on the big scenes. And this time I was looking for stuff like this. So mostly abstracts and little small scenes. So the details in a landscape, to get back to your question about what is a small scene, it's like the details in a landscape that resonate with me, and where for composition, that what I decide to exclude is as important as what I'm including. So I'm excluding so much of the context around me, and instead just focusing on, in this moment, what am I connecting with the most? And in this case, it was that transition, the different textures, the color, that kind of subtle line. So those were some of the ideas that were resonating, even though I was surrounded by things that I think many landscape photographers would have gravitated towards. Instead, I was on the side of the road photographing a little pond. So.
And that's the value of trusting your own vision And that's how you end up standing out. And I don't mean that in a showy way, but just kind of having your own style and seeing things that others don't see. I am curious to hear about this. We're seeing a film strip from Lightroom.
Yeah. So for this one was the ugly. And the reason I included this one is because Beth, I see you as somebody who experiments a lot, and you try a lot of different techniques. And so I was channeling some of the ideas that I see represented in your work. So in this case, this is a combination of the reason I included this is it didn't work, and it was really disappointing, but I was trying. So the tide is coming in, moving the seaweed, and then the wind is blowing across the surface. So those two counteracting movements were moving the seaweed in such an interesting direction. And I really wanted, what I was hoping for was like one area where there was a little calmness so you could see what was happening, and then really interesting waves around it. And it just didn't come together. So this was a channeling Beth that was a failure, but I learned a lot. So I'm going to try again. Because your work, I think, does such a great job of representing movement in interesting ways. So trying to integrate some more of that into my own work. And this scene had so much potential because the colors were really cool. The textures are really cool. And all those, but it's like the wind and the waves just weren't quite working together.
Yeah. Is this a scene you can go back to? Or seek out something similar in other places, probably.
Yeah, I would say seek out. And this was like on a very remote eastern fjord in Iceland, so not easy to get back to. But and the particular conditions, like it was like a certain tide, and the wind was blowing the seaweed towards the coast. So it was like a confluence of things that could have turned into a cool photo, but. Didn't.
But look at how much you experimented with it, and now a seed has been planted. You've got this vision, and you're going to carry it to other places, and it will show up somewhere, and it's probably going to show up in a surprising place and might show up differently. But just that you've tuned your radar a little bit to this, that's just cool.
Yeah, I'll try again this fall.
Yeah. So thank you for talking us through those images and telling a little bit about the story and evolution of them, because I think it's helpful for anybody. We're all in different stages in the journey, and it's helpful to have that kind of retrospective that you've just offered. I'm curious to talk for just a couple of minutes about inspiration and who or what inspires you, and what's your relationship, I suppose, to this concept of inspiration?
Yeah, this is one of those places where I do feel like I have a pretty different view on this topic, because I hear a lot of photographers talk about they're inspired by other people's photographs or by other photographers. And that has never resonated at all with me. And I think it's because I think it's a more complicated dynamic. So I think of inspiration, admiration, and influence as being a way to tease out a couple of really important components that I think when we talk about inspiration, we're actually talking about all three of those things. So for me, inspiration, like the thing that motivates me, is nature, that I want to get out and I want to explore. I want to be with my camera. If we think about influence, then if I, like, for instance, if I see one of your intentional camera movement photos and think, like, I've never given ICM much of a try, and Beth is doing really interesting work here, I now want to give that more serious consideration. I feel like that's more influence, like you're influencing me to try new things and maybe explore something different than I have before. And then the third overlapping circle would be admiration. That I think sometimes when people say somebody inspires them, it's actually a lot about admiring them. And that I feel like there are people that fall into all three of or not so much inspiration, but there are definitely people who have influenced me and people I admire. But I feel like the inspiration is nature, and that's I think teasing out those three has helped me in thinking about that concept a little bit more in a way that resonates more with me. So
yeah, that's beautiful, and it takes the pressure off inspiration. Like people saying, like, I'm just not feeling inspired. Like it's this mysterious thing. And the way you have broken that, teased that out and described it seems like it becomes more accessible and a little more practical.
Yeah, I think I always go back to the practical. So I think that's probably why it resonates more with me.
Yeah.
And I also feel like if I didn't have a lot of external inputs, so other people doing photography, like we talked about earlier, I would still pursue this. So that's why I feel like people are more influential and that I admire them more than they motivate or inspire me.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like people who do really incredible physical things or they're getting out of their comfort zone and like I feel like I'm inspired more by that. Like people who are doing things outdoors that are pushing their limits, like that I find inspiring. But I don't look at other people's photos and feel like that motivates me to photograph. No, like nature and like wanting to be outside, that's what inspires me. So just that's a little bit of the swirl of stuff that's going on in my brain around that topic.
Yeah. Awesome. Love it. And so I'd love to close with best or worst advice that you've either gotten or given. So your call on where you want to go with that.
I'll do both very quickly. So I think the best was Cole Thompson. It wasn't advice. Like the photo celibacy thing is what he does. So he's not telling other people to do it. Sure. But man, like in thinking about the most influential experiences I've had in my life and like probably have had the most, like have driven me forward in a specific way. That period of time of not looking at other people's photos and listening to my own voice was so valuable. And a lot of, when I say that, like in photo club presentations or in like dialogues like this, I get so much pushback. And it's like, it doesn't have to be right for everybody, but for some people, closing out external voices can be incredibly helpful. And then for the worst advice, I think if anybody tells you that there's a right way to do something or a best way to do something, they are doing you a disservice. And in the photography world, there is so much of that it's like, this is the way. No, there is no way. That I think it's much more helpful to listen to a lot of voices and think about what resonates most with you in this moment, or maybe it will in the future, and take bits and pieces from lots of different sources, both inside photography and outside photography, and use those to help guide your thinking and provoke new thinking and new practices. But anybody who has this gospel of the way, please, like I have many stories there, but I'll leave that one there.
Perfect. Well, that's one thing that I have appreciated from the start of you and your work is that you generously offer your perspective, your insight, your experiences. In my way of putting it is I say you can take, leave, or adapt as you see fit. Yeah, because it's not a one size fits all. So I love that you shared that as like the worst advice is there is a way, the way, because you really do embody that that openness and generosity and non-attachment to how people use what you offer. So thank you for that. So how can folks get in, lots of people already know you, so it almost seems not relevant, but in case somebody is new to you and wanting to learn more about you, what are the best ways to connect and follow?
My website, which is smallscenes.com, and that I share with my husband, Ron. And then I'm going to try to post more on Instagram and my blog. I have a blog, and then we have a newsletter. So Great. That's probably the best way to stay up to date with me is through my free newsletter. It's like 5% selling, 95% my content, and lots of stuff from other people too. So Great. Those would be the ways.
Awesome. And check out Beyond the Grand Landscapes. Yeah, just amazingly done. It includes interviews with other photographers. It's just a wealth of information. So I really hope that folks will also jump on board with that too.
Thank you for mentioning that, Beth.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, thank you, Sarah. It's been so fun. I feel like we could talk for hours, and and I'm sure that we will have future conversations. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It was so great to have this conversation. I really appreciate this and what you're doing overall. So best wishes for the future of your channel, and thank you very much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Let us know in the comments what was most useful or meaningful to you, and be sure to subscribe so that you're notified of future episodes. This channel is made possible in part by nature photography classes and their Inspired Creator Grant. You can learn more or submit your own application at naturephotographyclasses.com/inspiredcreator. Thank you again so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.